Welcome back to CBC News Network. We are tracking more breaking news out of Washington. The Washington Post reporting that the special counsel overseeing the investigation into Russian meddling in the U.S. election, Robert Mueller, is now investigating President Trump for possible obstruction of justice. According to the Post, the investigation into Trump began shortly after he fired the former FBI director, James Comey. Well, joining us now to talk about this is constitutional law expert Josh Blackman. And Professor Blackman, first of all, your reaction to this news report?
Well, thanks for having me back. The first thing to stress is that now we have confirmation that the investigation is aimed at Trump directly. In the past, what we learned was that some of Trump's surrogates, people in his network, were under perhaps investigation. Here, it's against Trump specifically. And the reason why, according to the Post, is that the firing of Comey is now criminally being investigated. So it wasn't so much anymore what happened in the campaign, it's the circumstances of whether firing Comey and things said before could amount to an obstruction of justice under law.
So much of this case has been so public. The interview that the president did, for example, with Lester Holt of NBC News, where President Trump said he fired Comey because of the Russia investigation. Comey's testimony from a week ago. So, you know, as I say, a lot of this is public. Based on what you've seen and heard, does this seem like at least the beginning of a case of obstruction of justice?
Well, there's one thing to keep in mind, right? The idea of obstruction of justice requires a certain intent, a mental state of mind. And the law requires that the president must impede an investigation corruptly. That's the key word, corruptly. So it's not enough to show that Trump actually impeded an investigation. You have to show what was his intent. And if you recall, during Comey's testimony, he recalled a conversation he had with Trump one-on-one, where he said, "I hope you can let this go. I hope you can let Flynn go." Is I hope a request? Is it an order? What exactly is it? And that's something that the government's investigating. A second issue, which is something for your listeners to understand, is that in American law, Mueller can't bring charges by himself. Even if at the end of this investigation he recommends that the president broke the law, it will be up to the Attorney General, or here the acting Attorney General, to bring charges. But there's never been a case where a sitting president was charged with a crime. It simply has never happened. So this is really uncharted waters.
And as I understand it, there is a long-standing policy, in fact, of the Justice Department not to pursue charges, not to indict a sitting president, a long-standing policy, but not an absolute law prohibiting the laying of charges.
You're exactly right. This is a question that no court has ever addressed. It's simply never happened that a president broke the law, that they would actually have to charge him. For example, Richard Nixon resigned before any charges could be brought. The one thing to keep in mind is that in our separation of powers, all prosecutors work for the president. And if the Attorney General decides to authorize criminal charges, the president can simply fire the prosecutor. That's why it's an odd sense that the president's subordinates will be prosecuting their boss for a crime. So from a separation of powers perspective, it's very strange indeed for even the notion the president could sit in a criminal trial.
And of course, to be fair, all we know tonight is the Washington Post citing 5 separate sources saying that the president is being investigated. So far from the laying of charges, far from the decision about whether charges ought to be laid. But as you look at this case in total, what about the powers of this special counsel in terms of getting people to speak, including presidential appointees who may not want to speak to him?
So the special counsel, Director Mueller, has fairly large discretion of who he can interview. He doesn't need to get permission to interview anyone. And he also has the power to request by what's called a subpoena, to request documents or other sources. I predict that the next phase in this saga will be the president tries to invoke what's called executive privilege to prevent people within his government from talking to the special prosecutor. And that's something that can go to court. Indeed, your viewers may recall in the 1970s, President Nixon tried to assert executive privilege to protect his tapes, which were recorded in the White House. And the Supreme Court held in a case called United States versus Nixon that this privilege does not go on forever, that there may be cases where the president's communications can be revealed in criminal prosecution. After that case, Nixon resigned fairly quickly, so it was never put to the test. But this is, again, very much uncharted waters we're in.
A story developing this evening, and it certainly will be, we think, the big political story of tomorrow. Josh Blackman, thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you so much.